Basically, what we're going to do to factor these polynomials is they call it the distributive, but I call it the greatest common factor. That means what's common between the numbers. I mean, what number divides into both the 18 and the 27. And 9 is the number that divides into both of those. And then we want to know the letters. And the letters are pretty simple. It's just the lowest exponents. We have a 2, we have a 1, so the lowest exponent is our greatest common factor. Now, because we're doing, the reason why they call it the distributive is because we're going to multiply. So I'm going to take out what's called the greatest common factor. This is the greatest common factor. Once I do that, I'm going to create a distributive property by dividing it with each of the terms. So 9 divides into 27 3 times, and y divides into y second is y. Remember, we subtract. And the 9 and 18 is a 2, and the y's cancels. So what we end up with is basically a distributive property problem that we could then check if I wanted to check by multiplying 9 times 3y, which would be 27y squared, and 9 times 2, which would give me 18y. If I get the same thing that I started with, here's my check, then I know I've factored correctly. So what's circled in red is the factoring problem. So to do a factoring by what's called grouping, we're going to take when we have an even number and we're going to group 2 at a time. So I'm going to group these 2 and then the next 2. By doing that, I can then factor each pair by looking at the greatest common factor. So what's common between the 4 and the 8? It's the 4. What's common between the Q, R, and the R is just the R. So when I divide that 4R out, I'm left with Q. And when I divide the 4R out with the 8, I'm going to be left with just a 2. Now if I do the same thing over here, what's common between the 3Q and the 6, I have a 3. And if I factor that out, I get Q plus 2. If you do this correctly, you will always end up with the same thing in the parentheses. And that is one of our answers. So we have parentheses. The other answer is the other two factors that are out here. So our answer is 4 plus 3. Keep it in mind, every time we do factoring, we want two things. We want the distributive property, and we end up, this is not the distributive property, but twice. We want it as one particular problem. And so there's the answer for grouping. Well, now we're going to do another grouping, but there's a little trick in this one. So we'll just do the same method, and I'll show you the trick. So I'm going to group my first 2, and I'm going to group my second 2. When I group my first 2, what's common is the 2 and the m. When I divide that out, I'm left with k minus 6. Here's the trick. See how I have a negative k, or negative 7k? So I'm going to take out the negative 7 instead of the positive, and that gives me a negative 6 plus k. And we can change the order because with this and make it k minus 6. And the reason we want to do that is, remember, we want the parentheses to be exactly the same. So this is just dividing out with a negative number, and it changes, so we end up with the same thing. And by doing that, we now have our factors, which are k minus 6, which is what's in parentheses. And then the other parentheses is what's left over on the outside, and that's 2m minus 7. And so there's our answer, which is the distributive problem, factoring.